So in this example, we're going to take a look at obtaining input from the user, or getting input from the user. Now, typically when you're working in IPython interactive mode, you don't need to prompt the user to give data to your program, because you are the user. You're the one interacting with IPython interactive mode. So if you need a piece of information, you could simply create a variable and give it a value. However, once you start working with scripts, sometimes you might want to acquire some information from the user, and as is the case with many things in Python, there is a built-in function to help you do that. That built-in function is called input, and it can, inside of its parentheses, receive an argument which tells the user to do something, what we call a prompt. So in this case, when I execute this statement, it prompts me asking what's your name, and I can now go ahead and whoops, I didn't mean to do all caps there. I can type my name, and when I press enter, the result is to take what I typed and give it to the variable name in this particular case. Now, input gives me back what I type as a string piece of information, so I can check that by evaluating the variable name and seeing that it gives me back a string containing the letters PAUL for my name. Now, notice that I did not input the quote characters as part of that string. Also notice back up here that I used a double quoted string as my prompt, because the prompt actually contained a single quote character. Throughout our code, we will typically use single quoted strings, which is the preference in the Python style guide, unless we have a string that contains a single quote, in which case we'll typically use a double quoted string or possibly a triple quoted string once in a while as well. So, of course, we can do things like display the variable that we just created, and when we display a string, the quote characters, excuse me, are not displayed by the print function. It just displays the characters within that string. Now, again, we did not input quote characters around the name, so let me go back 3 lines here and re-execute the code that's going to prompt me to enter my name. And let's assume that I accidentally typed in quote characters here. I just want to demonstrate what happens. And if I go ahead and evaluate name at this point, we're going to see that first of all, it's delimiting the string in memory with double quotes, and notice that the string contains the single quote characters that I type. So everything that I type in response to that prompt is going to be returned to me as a string piece of information that is then assigned to the variable name. And of course, because the string contains embedded quotes, if I go ahead and print that once again, you're going to see those quote characters get displayed as part of the output. So let's re-emphasize this fact that input always returns a string. So I'm going to go copy and paste another snippet here. We're going to create a variable called value1 that contains a value typed by the user, a number in particular. So let's assume for this purpose that I want to input the whole number or integer value 7, and that value will then get applied, or not applied, but stored in the variable value1. But it's a string piece of information. Now let's go ahead and do that again. Here we'll tell the user to enter a second number, and we'll name the variable value2 as well, so that we don't wipe out what we just created. So let's say we want to enter the second number. We'll give it the integer 3 in this case. And now let's assume that we want to do some arithmetic with these two variables. By the way, let's talk a little bit about tab completion once again. Of course, we have two variables that start out with the word value. So if I hit tab right now, notice it actually displays several things that start with VA, one of which is a function named vars, which we're not going to discuss at this point. But I know that I want to use value 1 at the moment, so I can use the down arrow key to actually navigate through all of these items. And you'll notice as I do that multiple times here, what is displaying in the line of code changes. So I'll select value 1 and I'll do a plus, and let's just go ahead in this case and select value 2. Now what you might expect here is to get the result 10 because we're adding the numbers 7 and 3, but input gave those both back to me as strings. So what's really going to happen here is what we call string concatenation. It's adding together the two strings by taking the string in value 2 and adding it to the end of the string in value 1. If you really want to process these things as numeric values, you have to convert the strings returned by input into numeric format. So let me go ahead and copy another snippet here. So let's now demonstrate how to do that conversion. And you saw this actually in an earlier self-check exercise, although I didn't really talk about it that way at the time. So I'm going to ask the user, myself, to enter an integer. Let's say in this case that we once again want to enter the whole number 7. And in order to treat value as an integer, we can write the following statement. Let me type it in here and then explain it. So remember, we introduced briefly the int function earlier. The int function takes its argument, in this case the variable called value, and converts it to an integer value, a whole number in this case. So it takes the string 7 and turns it into the number 7. Right, so let's go ahead and do that. Now, by doing that, we've just taken this variable called value, which was the string 7, and turned it into a completely different data type. It is now the number 7, and when you display a number in IPython, it does not wrap that item in quote characters. So you can see that I get the number 7 back, whereas up above we were getting strings when we evaluated the variable name, the variables that stored the strings we input. So you can convert any value to an integer using the int function. If it's not convertible to an integer, you'll get an exception, a runtime error message by doing that. Now, to demonstrate that we can, of course, perform arithmetic with something like that, let me go ahead and we'll input another value. Now, in this snippet, we're going to combine what we did here in the two snippets that I've highlighted up above. We're going to both input a value from the user, and we're going to convert it immediately to an integer, all in one expression, so that we don't have to do that as two separate statements. So when you have nested parentheses like this, the inner function will execute first. So the first thing I'm going to do is input from the user another integer value. The result of that input function will then become the argument to the int function, which will convert it to an integer. And at that point, we can then use that integer in an arithmetic expression. So let's go ahead and enter the value 13. And at this point, we can go ahead and display another value's contents, which is the number 13. And let's go ahead and do an arithmetic expression as well. So I'll input this expression, which is going to take the number 7 and the number 13 and add them together, and in this case we really do get a numeric value of 20. If these were string values, we would have gotten 7, 1, 3 as a result of string concatenation. Now, the int function is not always capable of converting values to integers. So let's go ahead and execute another snippet here where once again we're going to read a value from the user. We're expecting an integer, so we're going to convert it to an integer, but we're going to wind up with an exception here because I'm not going to type an integer. I'm going to type the string hello. Now there's no way to convert the string hello to a numeric value, so the int function is going to fail on that. And now what we see is one of those traceback messages indicating that something went wrong. In this case, we have what's known as a value error. A value error is typically going to appear when you have a value of the incorrect type that you're trying to process. So you can see here the more detailed error message says that invalid literal for int with base 10, hello. Not a very easy to understand error message, especially if you might happen to be new to programming, but basically what it's saying is that there's no way to convert the string hello into a numeric base 10 value, which is a decimal integer value. Now separately, we can also use the int function to convert floating point numbers to integers. So we used it to convert a string to an integer, and actually in the earlier self-check exercise we did something similar to the expression that I just typed here. If I go ahead and press enter, you can see that it truncates the floating point part of the number and gives me back the whole number 10 in this case.